Thank you very much for that fine introduction. Perhaps a more adequate title that you see on the screen should actually be a response to the art and era after one brief meeting with Albert Bierstadt by the Lakota Sioux, by the Lakota Sioux. Either way, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Particularly at this time in America, it's always a very, very special event to be before and among people who treasure the appreciation of the art and the history of this nation. I think more than ever at this time, we as Americans need to reappraise our heritage in terms of what it means to be a good American. And it was actually this sentiment that led me to participate in this particular activity. Over 42 years ago, when Peter was just a boy and starting his tenure as the director of this museum, the Plains Indian Museum had not been created yet, and his father and Lloyd New, who were members of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board of the Department of Interior, because of particular events that were occurring at that time, created a wanted list for the Buffalo Bill Museum, and at that time it was called the Buffalo Bill, well, I don't remember. Anyway, it's the Center of Buffalo Bill Historical Society, because they felt that they needed input from the Native American perspective, since Buffalo Bill had embraced and had done much for the Native people of the period of from the 1880s until his demise. I think was it 1914? Was it? Is it 17? Yeah, whatever. Anyway, they always had a very close relationship, and I just happened to be descended from one of the performers in the 1887 performance in England and the 1889 performance in Paris. And so I had a special interest. Anyway, that wanted list was for the establishment of the Indian Advisory Board for the forthcoming, the dream of the Plains Indian Museum, which I hope some of you have seen or have visited on at this time. Anyway, that wanted list generated a phone call from this institution, and upon the recommendation of Lloyd New and Royal Hazard, my being on the wanted list, and it said, "Arthur, could you come to Cody? There's something we would like you to do." And I thought, oh, well, what an opportunity. I'll be able to see what this is all about, and perhaps do some research on my great-grandfather. And so I came to that first meeting and have been coming back year after year for 42 years. And it was actually last year, 2017, in April, I got another call from the Buffalo Bill Center for the West. This time it was Peter himself. And he said, "Arthur, there's something I'd like you to do." And I thought, oh, now this is going to be, I'll be anxious to hear this. So I sat in my chair and listened to him. He explained that they were doing a Bierstadt, and I'd heard about it as a result of my association with the advisory board. And it was coming to fruition, and they were working on the catalog, and they were on a deadline. And he said, "Arthur, I'd like you to write a very brief introduction of 750 words and wherein you describe the relationship of the Bison to the Lakota people. And I thought, oh my God, what does this man think I am, 750 words. And I got the original manuscript of his text for the catalog. And I was very, very touched, because the last time I had had any occasion to contemplate Bierstadt was as an undergraduate student in 1962 at a small college in South Dakota where I was studying art. And I sympathize with you right now, because one of those courses was art appreciation, where you sat in a dark room right after lunch and had to look at numerable slides. And I empathize with you if you wish to take a little nap, because I know precisely what you might be going through. Not only that, but much later I had to teach that course, and it was a problem of the teacher trying to stay awake. But be that as it may, I hadn't, but I had, and at those times you studied art of the world, the Western Hemisphere, beginning with the Paleolithic, and going through the Neolithic. Then you go to Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then the Mycena, and then you go all the way through the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, and so forth. So it was a very classical kind of education. But there was also a course called American Art, the history of American art, and that's when I first encountered Bierstadt and Moran and the Western artists of the Western landscape. And just being a little guy, and the only mountains I had ever seen were the Black Hills of South Dakota, and those were not snowcat mountains. But on the other hand, I could identify with those paintings, because many of the scenes, perhaps on a more miniature scale, for those of you who have been to the Black Hills, there are valleys and lakes and water, and you can stand by those and look up at the higher peaks. And then in our painting classes, of course, acrylics had not been invented at that time, so we had to deal in oils and watercolor and gouache. And the usual regimen for an art student was that you are shown the work of the masters, and you are expected to assimilate. So the professor would examine these paintings, and Bierstadt was one of the artists, and he said, look at the command of light and the atmosphere. And I was gratified to hear Peter talking about heaven and God when he was talking about Bierstadt's paintings, because my professor also said, as artists, you should feel the presence of something much mightier than you when you look at these works, and know that this is by the hand of a gifted person. And that's why you're here, to learn and appreciate these kinds of images. And so I proceeded from that time, and after all those years, my main thrust, at first I was an art educator, then as a result of being affiliated with the Buffalo Bill Center of the West and the Plains Indian Museum, I was inspired to go back and get a second degree, a second master's degree. There was a first one from Penn State, which was in art education, and I soon got tired of teaching white teachers how to teach white kids white art. And as a result of my involvement with this institution, I went back and did work in Native American art and Native American painting, and the history of Native American tribes and their spiritual beliefs and their approaches to the universe. And so when I was reading Peter's manuscript, I thought, well, there is something here. And I was particularly infatuated with the encounter of Rocky Bear and the Sioux delegation at the gallery in Paris, witnessing and seeing the Bierstadt painting and his reaction. Rocky Bear was from the Pine Ridge Reservation, and he was at least 30 years older than my great-grandfather. But there was a time when, and you see the names Red Shirt and Black Elk, they appear in the literature in terms of the Paris and London expositions. Well, my great-grandfather was of the same vintage. He was born in 1859, and I think Rocky Bear was born in 1839. I think he was like 50 years old at the time in Paris. Be that as it may, because of that connection, I was terribly excited to pursue something in this exhibition. And I had previously encountered on a research trip to the South Dakota Historical Society Museum and other museums in the United States, I encountered and discovered a muslin that had been painted by my great-grandfather. And we will get into that in a few minutes. But the idea of alternative views of the bison. Now, the view of the time of Bierstadt that you're familiar with is a perspective that the bison were disappearing, and because Native people were their lives were so intertwined with the bison and its bounty that it provided them, that in fact, I think Phil Sheridan is the one who said, you get rid of the buffalo and you get rid of the Indians, their lives are so intertwined. And I thought, well, that's not true, because the Indian people are still here, and so are the bison. And so they may have gotten them down to 400 head of buffalo that Peter was talking about, but believe me, those Lakotas and those Indian people were much more persistent. They never quite got down to just 400. But the idea of there are alternative relationships, I'm sure, which have generated the longevity of the Native people beyond that time period. And it's some of those that I would like to address this afternoon. That not to take counter, indeed the bison was central to many of the economies of the Native peoples of the plains. But there were also additional relationships that they had. For example, at one time there were actually vast herds of prairie elk. I mean, it wasn't until much later, when the buffalo, when the settlers moved across the plains, that even the elk herds were retreated to the higher reaches of mountain regions. But according to Native perspectives and oral history, there were vast herds of elk and deer and antelope and bear, which existed but were gradually driven into other places or reduced in numbers. And looking at the material culture of these tribes, elk and deer were actually the preferred hides for daily garments. Buffalo hide was a little bit tough, and it was really difficult to tan. So it was reserved for the things such as the teepees, the riding gear, carrying cases, robes for wearing, and sometimes moccasins. But the sinew found on the back of an elk or a deer along the tenderloin The casing, you know what a beef tenderloin is like. It has that sheath of muscle on it. That was the preferred sewing material to take it off and dry because it was softer and thinner, and the bison, while usable, was usually reserved for more utilitarian, larger kinds of things. However, the meat of the buffalo was the staple. And I don't know what the staple of the American modern home is today. It's probably macaroni and cheese and pizza for many people. But in that case, long ago, buffalo was by far the major commodity of existence. If you wanted fresh meat, that's where the deer and the antelope and the elk came in, but that could also be made into jerky. But it was often a part of the growing up regimen of young men, young boys, to go out and hunt the deer and the elk, so that there was always a ready supply of fresh meat and intestines and tripe and all those other parts of the animals that were used. So I took issue with the idea of the Indians' relationship with the bison being monolithic. And of course, history has proven that the Indian people were adaptable enough to be able to use other animals and other growing things to sustain themselves. In particular, the riverine tribes, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, the Arikara, the Omaha, the Pawnee. A part of their sacred constellation and a part of their diet was dependent upon the crops of corn and beans and squash and sunflower seeds and the dried berries that grew along the rivers. And the buffalo on periodic hunts or harvesting those that came down to the Missouri River to drink and to cross the river. You saw the photos of the buffalo crossing the river. And in fact, one of the great delicacies of the Mandan Hidatsa were those buffaloes that didn't quite make it across and drowned and kind of floated down the river, and to go out and retrieve those. You already had aged meat, you know. It was and particularly the tenderloin. And I worked in the restaurant business to earn my way through university. And this was at Mount Rushmore National Monument. They had a fine dining service. And we prepared our own buffalo filet mignon. And we had this master butcher and meat preparer. Anyway, we'd walk into these lockers, and there would be these long pieces of meat hanging on hooks, and they were covered with green fuzz. And those were aging filet mignons, mind you. Anyway, you cut that outside off and cut them and smash them down. Anyway, as I say, the Mandan Hidatsa weren't fools. They knew how to get a good filet mignon, you know, from those bison floating down the river. Anyway, and then there was also intertribal trade, wherein the people who did not raise crops of corn and beans and squash, and we're talking about the Shoshone, the Crow, the Lakota, and Arapaho and Cheyenne. All these people traded dried buffalo meat at these river valleys for these other foodstuffs, the dried corn and the dried squash. And so there was additions too. So it wasn't just, as the phrase goes, you didn't just, as far as the bison go, hunt, kill, eat, hunt, kill, eat. You know, you also got excesses, and you traded them to other tribes for other foodstuffs, and then you augmented the the diet with other animals and other animal parts. Anyway, that was my initial reaction. And in historical times, anyway, the adaptability and resilience of native people, had not had that prior to the decimation of the bison, it would have been difficult. There could have been the demise of both species, but it didn't happen. And then the second part of my presentation has to do with the after effects. As I said, the other title of this symposium is The Changing West. Anyway, these are some of the things I want to talk about now, which is the effect of the Buffalo Bill expositions, the traveling expositions to Europe, because that had a profound effect on some of the lives of native people, particularly those who were recruited as performers. And it was in this area where we meet Bierstadt. Anyway, this is my great-grandfather, Standing Bear. He was born in 1859 and participated in the pre-reservation hunting lifestyle. Excuse me. In 1876, as a young warrior, he also participated in expeditions against the Crow, on horse-stealing raids, and I'll say horse-stealing because they were stealing the horses of the enemy. And so he was active as a warrior prior to 1889, and in 1876 he participated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and he was a young man at the age of 17 at that time, but at that time 17-year-olds were thought of as mature warriors. And his skill at observation enabled him much later to do a whole series of muslin paintings of the battle and what was happening in the battle, and those have been verified as fairly accurate records by military historians and those who have written books on the Battle of the Little Bighorn. They see in there great elements of congruence with other accounts, and those are in various other places. I might say, people, there is a book, an exhibition catalog of my last retrospective, where I get into extensively the work and where they are of this gentleman. They're in museum collections throughout the country and have been written about by other scholars. And but he, as I said, as a young man, he was very observant, and not until after he lived on the reservation did he become the kind of artist that he became. And I mention this because the catalog that I'm talking about, also there's an exposition, a further exposition of the muslin that's on display in the Bierstadt exhibition. It's in that glass case as you come down the stairs. There's a further exposition of that, and that is for sale in the bookshop here at the museum if you wish to pursue any more about that particular painted muslin. But Standing Bear then surrendered. He was with the Crazy Horse Band when they surrendered at Fort Robinson in 1877, following the Battle of the Little Bighorn. From there, he moved to the reservation at Red Cloud Agency, which was at Fort Robinson, and eventually found himself at the new location in 78, I believe, at Pine Ridge. And it was about that time that he had a previous Indian wife and child that he left behind to join the first Wild West show in 1887. And there he performed along with his friend Black Elk. And those of you who have read the book Black Elk Speaks, or the book The Sacred Pipe by Joseph Epps Brown, will recognize that name, Black Elk. He's one of the foremost figures in Native American religious beliefs and practices. And it was at this time, in the 1880s, when about 1883 is when the great ceremonies had been banned. Anyway, he had also participated in the pre-reservation sacred traditions and was knowledgeable about the mythology of the Lakota. And an important part of that mythology had to do with the bison, how in a pre-primordial time living beneath the earth, the humans and the bison emerged from the same origin, almost the same species, but one became human, one became animal. And I'm telling you this because the relationship to the bison also has sacred implications. And how the bison, through some transgression of some type in the primordial mythological world, is compelled then, ever after, to sacrifice itself on the behalf of humans. But because of that relationship, the buffalo must be thought of as a relative. It's a very special relationship, one wherein one sacrifices one's life for the other. And so the relationship of the Lakota to the bison was based and founded upon sacred principles. And indeed, the extension goes even further, because an important part of the Lakota mythology was the appearance of the white buffalo calf maiden. She's a heroine figure who mysteriously and mystically appears before the Lakota people and brings them the first sacred pipe. And with that gift of the pipe, she gives them the major rituals and ceremonies that they are to enact, a part of which in each one the bison is mentioned. And indeed the buffalo head, the skull, serves as an altar and the actual presence of the spirit of the bison from primordial mythological time. This remembrance of this relationship is exhibited by the use of the head and the buffalo parts, the shed hair attached to one's own hair or to the garments of the participants. The bison hide and the bundle placed in the sacred tree is made of bison hide. And there are little figures hung in the sacred tree of a man and a bison, which depicts the interrelation and interdependence of the bison and and humankind, how they are bound to each other in a sacred relationship of respect and reverence. And it's these kinds of relationships that were remembered or known by the pre-reservation Lakota people, and it's these beliefs that continued after the reservations were established. To get back to the buffalo calf maiden, she comes and she brings the sacred pipe to them and preaches to them and gives them the ceremonies and how they're to be conducted. And then she leaves, and as she leaves, she sits down and stands up, and she turns into a red buffalo, and then she turns into a blue buffalo, And then the final color change is she stands up and turns into a white buffalo and runs away over the hills. But to this very day, the figure is a prominent part of contemporary Native American Lakota Sundance ceremonies. And it's a recalling and a remembrance of that sacred relationship between the Lakota and the Bison. And so there are numerous, besides the objects in the material culture made by made from buffalo hide, and today there are still requirements in the making of paraphernalia and objects used in ceremonies that they do be made of bison hide as a remembrance of this ancient relationship. And so it is that it was these kinds of beliefs that these people in Paris in 1889 still had in their heads. And indeed, Rocky Bear may have even been recalling some of the memories of this when he saw this painting of the Indian with the up against the bison. He and the other people in the retinue would have had these kinds of thoughts in their head when they saw that painting. How marvelous that here in the midst of this place where we've been for a long time, or this new place, I mean, good heavens, they were witnessing the Eiffel Tower with electric lights, you know, and then those wonderful elevators that you could go up on. In fact, Emily Burns provided me with some wonderful information about the actual time. It was August 13th, 1889, when this group of Lakota, including my great-grandfather, actually went to the top of the Eiffel Tower. And anyway, in the midst of all these wonders, the bridges, the churches, the cathedrals, the streets, the carriages, the boats that visitors traveled on along the Seine River, you know, docking at these various sites, all of those were wonderment, you know. And in fact, I'll get into that later, but there are oral stories told by these people who had visited the Wild West show sites, who recounted back home the wonderful stories of the things they saw and the things they did, and the things that they found amazing. Anyway, this is, let me go, I'm going to have to go back here. Okay, this is Standing Bear in his business suit, and this is his wife, Louise. Now, there's a reason why I'm standing here before you, talking to you about this, because Standing Bear participated in the Wild West show in Barcelona, and then I believe Naples and Rome. And by the time the show got to Vienna, Austria, he had been injured and had to stay behind. And he met and married this Austrian middle-class woman who was educated. And like many European women at that time, she was quite infatuated. Oh, if you could hear the stories about the women who pursued Red Shirt, you know, some of those are remarkable. He was this very, very handsome, attractive man, and the ladies just dearly loved him. Well, in this case, Louise became infatuated with him, and when he was injured and left behind, then he remained in their home. Her uncle was the surgeon, and she was the assistant to the surgeon. And so they took him home with them, and then in 1891, they returned to the United States, and she came as his wife. And they settled on the Pine Ridge Reservation, And essentially she engineered his life into a productive, prosperous rancher and artist. Anyway, their first home would have looked like this. This is not it. And by 1910, they had received their own allotment of 360 acres. Land was being divided up, after 1889 and the Black Hills Agreement. The reservations were reduced and excess lands. The land was divided up and allotted to individuals for individual ownership, and the excess was given to immigrants and at that time from Europe and people who wanted free land in the West. They could come and get a piece of Pine Ridge Reservation for anyway. So the early home looked like that, but because of her gregariousness, eventually they owned cattle and huge gardens, and she was able to make a great deal of money. And they built a nice home with a shingled roof, and it had a wooden floor, and it had glass windows. And this was taken in 1919, and it's Standing Bear and his Austrian wife. And I say that she learned. It was essential that she learned the Lakota language if she was going to survive, because he refused to learn English or German, and so she learned the Lakota language, and his relatives, his female relatives, taught her the Lakota traditions and homemaking, and she in turn taught them modes of European horticulture, raising gardens, and animal husbandry, how to raise cattle, take them out to the pastures and to milk them. And so cream and cottage cheese and all sauerkraut and dill pickles and various jams and jellies and various kinds of pastries also found their way into the reservation setting of Standing Bear and his relatives and his descendants. So here they are at their home, and then here they are in front of their home. The lady on the left here is my own grandmother. She was his youngest daughter, and that's her firstborn daughter and her first husband. Tuberculosis was quite rampant at this time, and for some odd reason she didn't have very good luck with her husbands. She ended up having 3 of them, and this was her first husband. But this is actually a photograph of a very typical Lakota family at this time. There's a grandfather, a grandmother, albeit she's Austrian, a grandfather, a grandmother, a father, a mother, a baby, and either a missionary or an anthropologist. Because Louise knew German and English, German, English, and also French, but because she knew English, she served something as an interpreter. And so their home was a destination for particularly German anthropologists. They just loved coming to the reservation and staying at Standing Bear and Louise's house because she could interpret in German. And here is, I want to go back here. This is Standing Bear in about 1933. Because of his prosperity, he became a leader of the community, a chief as it was, because he had a lot of wealth that he could distribute to the less fortunate. People would come from great distances and camp in his yard if they were in need. And indeed, he spearheaded something of a co-op, whereby the people who were less fortunate and not knowing how to garden and ranch could come and live at their place. and assist in the planting and the cultivating. And then when the harvest came, the corn, the beans, the squash, the potatoes, all those things, the bounty of the garden was divided up among all those people who would then take it back to their own little allotments, and they'd have food for the winter. In addition to that, he drove large herds of cattle up on the Red Shirt table where his cousins Red Shirt and High Eagle would tend the cattle during the summertime, and then in the winter time, or in the fall, they would have a huge cattle drive, and all the cattle would be brought back to Manderson, to the home place, where they would winter in pastures where hay had been provided all summer long. And so the people in the community had a good source as a chief. You know, he was very generous, and it was his obligation then to feed his community, which he did very dutifully as a traditional leader. This, as I say, in about 1933, here he is wearing his chief's outfit. The little horse hoofs that you see beaded here, there's 5 of them, and those account for the 5 times that he went on expeditions against the enemy, you know. Just one of those little horse hoof prints represents the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The others are indicative of his forays among the Crows, and at which time one of his brothers was killed, and he killed Crows and so forth. And but those were all recounted, and along with those kinds of stories were also tales of the experiences in Europe. And here are his 2 daughters in about 1960. And you just have to believe that those Lakota genes must have been terribly, terribly potent, because there's no way you can detect an Austrian in these faces. And this was my grandmother, who was responsible then for carrying on the life of this mixed blood family. As a descendant, she inherited the place, and she continued the tradition of providing largesse for members of the community of her generation. And in 1997, I received a Lila Wallace Arts International Fellowship, where I lived and resided at the home of Claude Monet, the Claude Monet Foundation. And my whole project was based on the fact that I was going to go back and I was going to visit Paris and try to experience or re-experience some of the stories I had been told as a youngster when these elderly Lakota men, Rocky Bear and Red Shirt and Black Elk would gather. They would tell stories about their experiences abroad. Unfortunately, nobody ever heard them talk about Bierstadt, though, so it must not have been that impressive. Anyway, so the stories that I told by the time I heard them were coming from my grandmother. She had lived with her, with her own Austrian mother, and heard stories about Europe and the European way of life from her own mother, but also the stories of Standing Bear and his friends as they traveled about with the Wild West shows. And some of their observations are, I was thinking about some of them when I was in Paris. Anyway, I actually went to old bookstores and the left bank looking for material, old newspapers. I found with illustrations from the 1889 exposition, and posters and photographs from historical periods, from later visits, and I gathered those. And as I said, I don't know much about Bierstadt because I'm one of those contemptuous, brainless art mongrels, you know. and as I said, while I had classical training in oil portraiture and so forth, I've degenerated into a brainless art mongrel who makes collages. Anyway, one of the so I would spend my days going to the sites that had been mentioned in the family traditions. And anyway, I gathered my collage materials, and I was remembering some of the things that had been said from the past. Anyway, the ladies liked the shawls, the fabrics, the embroidered or woven tapestry-like shawls, you know, those Victorian shawls with flowers and things on them. That was one of their favorite acquisitions. So the text down here, it says, we really like the china, the shawl, with flowers on it, made from thread. In other words, the embroidered European-style silk shawls they liked. Anyway, one of the other comments had to do with the ladies and their bustles. You know, they commented that there must be something wrong with those European women. They have deformed lower bodies, you know. But in terms of all the types and kinds of people were there, those are represented by this crowd. These are all separate little images cut from period magazines, which I've laminated and colorized. And here is Standing Bear all by himself among the crowd. But then the idea of the broadsides, you know, which were spread throughout Paris about the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, advertising the Wild West show, though that's here also. That time we were there, we saw them, the other one says, that time we were there, we saw them give their children Minisha, wine. Those women had deformed lower bodies too. Anyway, here's a lady down here giving her child a drink of wine, and of course we all know that what Paris water would have been like at that time. So it was probably a safeguard against getting dysentery, you know, and. Anyway, so it's a combination of materials gathered in Paris while I was there, and the oral tradition, and trying to remember and putting together remembrances of now, had I known about Bierstadt at that time, that they had visited that studio, I would have tried to find the building where that gallery was, and I would have made a collage. I may still do it. Okay, here is another view of the Paris experience, and this is actually a poster. Whoops, excuse me. This is actually a poster from the time, from the period. People were going back and forth from London or England and Paris, and this is one of the types of ships that would have been available for those crossings. And indeed, Black Elk had stayed behind and in England, and was there and traveled other places in Europe. But this would have been the type of ship that he would have crossed the English Channel to get to Paris when Buffalo Bill arrived there. And it says, this was that time Sapa came back to us on a boat from grandmother England's, England's home place. He told us he left his girlfriend over there. Anyway, here's his girlfriend. He said he would come back for her, but he never did. Anyway, he crossed when the Wild West show arrived in Paris, the errant Black Elk shows up and says he's been been there for 2 years, and now he wants to go home. So Buffalo Bill gave him a ticket home, and he left the Wild West show, and it's time to go, isn't it? Yes. Okay, I will just dash through this hurriedly. That time went really fast, but here's a countryside with the people, and the car is just and then here's another one, and here they are in Venice. And Queen Victoria, they had a special fascination for her. And then here is when they gathered. This is when he returned home. His veterans from the little Bighorn would come and visit and gather and camp, and they would talk about old times. And here's his wife, and here's his family again, and here's his daughters later, and here's the muslin. I wanted to show you. This is when I first discovered it, but I wanted to show you Bierstadt's wounded bison in the corner that we were talking about. That's not the only one. Look at this poor guy. And this one here. And shows the intensity of the hunt, the little anthropomorphized faces. And here's that little fellow. Right here. And then the bounty, the teepees, the dried meat, the preparation of all those things, and the Sundance itself. There's the little image of the bison and the man in the tree, and celebrating the cycle of life and dependence upon it. Thank you very much.